You feel like something inside you has broken, but you don't know what. Nothing external has changed that much, and yet everything seems to have lost its meaning. The things that once made you run now leave you empty. People remain the same, but you no longer fit in them. And deep down, you know, it's not the world that's crumbling, it's your old self. Carl Jung said that every spiritual crisis begins when the ego tries to sustain a life the soul has already abandoned. That's why it hurts. That's why it feels like you're losing control, but maybe it's not loss. Maybe it's liberation. If you've made it this far, it's no coincidence. This is synchronicity, the unconscious's silent response when your soul cries out for change. And I'm not here to calm you. I'm here to remind you of what you already know, but are still afraid to admit. The collapse of the ego is not the end. It's the beginning, the very point at which the self begins to emerge. You're not going crazy, you're awakening. And this awakening hurts because the lie was too comfortable. So sign up now, not to follow yet another spirituality channel, but to stop running away from your own truth. Because here, no one will offer you lightness before you've overcome the weight. You didn't stumble upon this video, your unconscious pushed you. Carl Jung would call this synchronicity, the precise encounter between your pain and the message that can penetrate it. Spirituality doesn't arrive with lit candles. It arrives as a collapse, like the moment when the ego, tired of maintaining its mask, finally gives in. Perhaps you felt this in the silence of a dark room, or in the midst of a crowd that doesn't see you. It's when the shadow begins to whisper, there's something you need to remember. The call of the soul rarely sounds pretty. It hurts, confuses, disorganizes. It's life ripping away from you what's already expired. The self begins to pull the strings, and the theater of the persona begins to crumble. No warning is given, only the feeling that what once moved you has lost its flavor. You can recognize this call in small ruptures, the job that drains you, the relationship that dries up, the mirror that returns a stranger. The unconscious uses discomfort as language. Jung said that the ego needs to be wounded to open the way to consciousness. That's why everything seems to fall apart when in fact something is being born. When a spiritual crisis begins, it's not because life hates you, but because it loves you enough not to let you remain numb. It's the self knocking on the door and saying, the theater is over, now it's the rehearsal of truth. And in that moment, spirituality ceases to be a concept and becomes survival. The invisible call doesn't ask for an explanation, it demands surrender. It's when you realize your plans no longer fit, that control is an addiction and chaos is a teacher. The ego tries to negotiate, but the unconscious has already signed the sentence. You will change, whether you like it or not. The shadow, which once frightened you, begins to gain a voice. It doesn't want to punish you, it wants to integrate you. And each collapse is an invitation to go back inward. You can ignore it, run away, rationalize, but the call doesn't stop. It only repeats itself more loudly until you listen, and when you do, the old world begins to silently unravel. It's the harbinger of transformation, the first rip that paves the way for what comes next. There comes a point when suffering ceases to be an accident and becomes a ritual. Carl Jung called this the threshold of transformation, the exact moment when pain becomes a passage. You begin to realize that the collapse of the ego is not punishment, but purification. Spirituality here ceases to be poetry and becomes surgery. Everything that is not true within you begins to rot. It is the body reacting to the lie. Old certainties lose their ground, and the self silently begins to dig tunnels beneath your life, tearing down everything that supported the false. What was once a comfort zone is now a cemetery, and your soul, restless, begins to scream for air. This threshold is painfully precise. It doesn't arrive a minute before or after the appointed time. It's the moment when the unconscious realizes that the ego no longer has the strength to pretend. Jung said that when the psyche wants to evolve, it first destroys what is too small for the new to be born. That's why, at this point, everything solid begins to dissolve. Routine loses its meaning, relationships reveal cracks, the body expresses what the soul can no longer bear to keep silent, and you, without understanding, try to mend what was born to be broken. But there's no mending when life decides to remake the entire fabric. This is where many give up. They try to return to the old world, believing that chaos is a mistake, when, in fact, it is divine architecture. The collapse of the ego is the earthquake that opens the ground for the self to flourish. And if you have the courage not to run away, you will realize that destruction is merely a disguise for reconstruction. The threshold of transformation is not a punishment, it is a baptism. It is the moment when the shadow becomes an ally and suffering a tool. But few cross it, because crossing it requires death. And those who still cling to the persona are not reborn. It is in this abyss that the next call reveals itself: emptiness. There's a point in the journey where nothing makes sense anymore. Neither the past serves you nor the future calls to you. It's the interval between deaths and births. Jung called this state the sacred void, the moment when the ego has been stripped of everything and the self has not yet taken on a new form. The mind, in despair, calls it collapse. But spiritually, it's gestation. It's the womb of the new. Here, there's no identity to defend, no certainties to hold on to. You feel the ground disappear, but the ground must disappear for wings to emerge. True spirituality happens in this space of suspension, where even breathing hurts, but each breath is an act of faith. In this void, the ego tries to create distractions. It seeks new roles, new loves, new addictions to avoid facing the absence of meaning. But the unconscious is patient. It will let you knock on all the wrong doors until you understand. There is no way out, only in. Emptiness is the invitation to stop running, to let the self work in the dark. It's like an artist shaping something you can't yet see. And silence, as unbearable as it may seem, is the language of this process. If you endure silence, it will become sound. If you endure nothingness, it will become everything. But almost no one can stand to remain, because emptiness exposes the shadow, and the shadow is frightening. It reveals everything you tried to hide, the voices, the guilt, the wounds. And that's where the collapse of the ego deepens, not as punishment but as childbirth. It's the self making its way through the ruins. And if you have the courage not to fill this space with illusions, you'll discover that emptiness is pure presence. The place where the soul whispers the truth that noise has always drowned out. It's at this point that the wound reveals itself, and what once seemed like destruction begins to show itself as medicine. All pain has a signature. No spiritual crisis happens by chance. Carl Jung said that suffering is the scalpel of the unconscious. It cuts only what is necessary to free what was imprisoned. The wound that bleeds you the most is the same one that carries the antidote. This is why the collapse of the ego hurts so much. It hits exactly where the self needs to be born. True spirituality is not anesthesia, it is surgical precision. Every loss is a bitter medicine dosed by the unconscious. Every rejection, every failure, every loneliness is the psychic body expelling what no longer fits. You are not being punished, you are being purified. The ego, in its arrogance, believes that healing comes through conquest. But Jung taught that true healing comes from accepting the shadow, from what the ego denies. That's why the wound is the portal. Suffering is the only language the unconscious uses when you don't hear its whispers. When it needs to scream, it uses pain. And if you look closely, you'll see that the situations that broke you the most are also the ones that revealed you the most. The shadow doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to be integrated. That's why it insists. That's why it repeats. And every time you run away from the pain, you run away from your own soul. There's something profoundly liberating in facing the wound as a teacher. When pain comes, instead of resisting it, ask, "What do you want to show me?" This simple shift in posture transforms collapse into awareness. Writing about what hurts, walking alone without distractions, meditating in silence, these are ways to let the unconscious speak, not to understand everything, but to let the self reorganize the chaos. Because the wound is a laboratory. It's where the soul makes meaning. And when you accept the medicine, apparent madness begins to reveal itself as lucidity. There comes a point in the journey when everything that seemed normal begins to seem insane. It's the moment the ego loses its monopoly on reality. Carl Jung said, "This is the point at which consciousness expands, and the price of expansion is the temporary loss of ground." You begin to see the world as it is, not as you've been taught to see it. Normal reveals itself as a collective illness. Working until you're empty, smiling without feeling, obeying without thinking. Social sanity is just a well-rehearsed mask. And when your soul awakens, you no longer fit into this performance. This is where confusion arises. The old self tells you you're going crazy. The self whispers that you've finally begun to wake up. Lucid madness is the price of truth. When the shadow is integrated, the unconscious reveals the world's theater. You begin to realize that most people live hypnotized, not by something mystical, but by invisible conditioning. And this is devastating, because seeing hurts more than being blind. It's the beginning of true spirituality, when seeing becomes more painful than ignoring. Jung said that awakening is like a fever. The body burns until the old ego dissolves. You feel vertigo, confusion, isolation, but it's not regression, it's purification. It's the self taking command of the ship that the ego kept on autopilot. At this stage, the danger is twofold: believing you're crazy or believing you're enlightened. Both are tricks of the ego. Authentic lucidity is silent. It doesn't shout, it doesn't show off, it doesn't try to convince. It observes, and whoever observes becomes whole again. When you realize the world seems surreal, don't fight it. Observe. See how people move, notice the falseness of appearances, realize how conversations are just noise. And when you realize, don't rebel, understand, because this lucidity that seems like madness is the beginning of freedom, and whoever resists it goes back to sleep. But whoever sustains the gaze enters the most dangerous territory of all, that of the courage to remain. Few make it this far. Most retreat when the void begins to scream. Carl Jung said that the most important moment of the spiritual journey is when you want to escape and choose to stay. Staying when the ego begs for anesthesia is a wild act of faith. The courage to remain is born when you understand there is no return to unconsciousness. You've seen too much, felt too much, awakened too much to settle for a comfortable lie. This is where spirituality ceases to be an ideal and becomes a discipline, not of strength, but of surrender. The self asks for proof. Do you trust me even when all seems lost? And only those who answer yes without words make it through. The ego will try every trick in the book to rescue you back to your old life. It will promise quick relief, sweet distractions, reconciliations with what has already died. It knows that if you hold on a little longer, it will disappear. And that's why the ego's collapse intensifies here. Not as punishment, but as a last gasp of control. And Jung said that the unconscious pushes the individual to the limit to reveal that the limit is not real. This is how courage is born, not from the absence of fear, but from intimacy with it. Staying, breathing, observing the storm without running. It is the silent resistance that transforms pain into a portal. When you decide to stay, something changes. Despair ceases to be an enemy, and becomes a master. Fear becomes a compass. The shadow that once haunted you now walks beside you. This is the initiation few complete, enduring silence, uncertainty, and not knowing. It is what separates the seeker from the distracted, and when the ego finally bows, the self ignites the first spark of new consciousness. But before it illuminates everything, there is one last crossing, the darkest of all, the one that rips you from your skin and throws you into the heart of the night, the midnight of the soul. This is where most believe they are dying, and in a way, they are. Carl Jung called this point the dark night of the soul, the moment when the ego finally unravels and the self begins to breathe. Everything you believed yourself to be dissolves. No label works, no prayer brings answers, no certainty offers shelter. It is the desert of the spirit. The silence is so dense it almost makes noise. The shadow, now unfiltered, shows you everything you denied, every lie you told to survive, every role you played to be loved. And it is in this brutal confrontation that the soul is honed. The pain here is not a mistake, it is a passage. It is the symbolic fire burning away the remnants of the persona. The midnight of the soul isn't a poetic concept, it's a physical experience. You wake up in the middle of the night, feeling a nameless emptiness in your chest. Tears come for no reason. The hours drag by. Everything seems dead, but something inside insists on pulsing. Jung said it's at this point that the unconscious takes control and begins the process of psychic reorganization. The collapse of the ego is complete, and the self begins to build a new center. This is the moment when spirituality ceases to be a search and becomes spiritual survival. Pain becomes a teacher, fear becomes a map. You don't know who you are, but you know you can't go back to who you were. But it is precisely in this darkness that the light hides. The midnight of the soul is the disguise of the dawn. The self prepares the ground in silence while the ego cries for help. And it is in this contrast that the new begins to form. Everything that feels like it is dying is actually giving way to real life. It is the complete inversion of the ego's values. What was once loss becomes liberation. What seemed like an end is a beginning. Death is but the shadow of birth. And when the first spark of this new consciousness emerges, chaos begins to reveal coherence. The world, once a ruin, begins to reorganize itself. There comes a time when chaos begins to make sense, not because it disappeared, but because you learned to dance within it. Carl Jung said that returning to sanity is not about returning to who you were, but remembering who you always were, the self behind the character. After the dark night, the light doesn't come from outside, it shines within. The world remains the same, but you don't. Spirituality ceases to be a quest and becomes a state. Simple things regain their soul. The air seems more alive, the silence more livable. You realize you no longer need to control the flow, you just need not resist it. The ego tries to return, but now it's just a servant, no longer king. This return is silent. There are no fireworks, no promises, no glory. There is presence. Jung called this integration, when the ego and the shadow face each other without war. The collapse of the ego has fulfilled its function. It has made room for reality to enter. You begin to understand that sanity was never about fitting into the collective madness, but about seeing the truth and still choosing love. The self doesn't want perfection, it wants wholeness. And wholeness includes the parts you tried to bury. Therefore, living awake is a paradox. It hurts more, but weighs less. You feel everything, but you no longer identify with anything. And when this new awareness stabilizes, the world seems to recognize you again. Synchronicities multiply, coincidences align, signs become living language. It's as if the universe responds, Now you understand. This is true sanity, not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that transforms it into wisdom. You no longer need to prove, defend, or belong. Just be. And being now is enough. But be careful. Awakening is not the end of the journey, it's the beginning of another, because once you've seen, you can no longer unsee. And once the self has revealed itself, life will demand that you live accordingly. No disguises, no escape, no turning back. Did you realize life never wanted to destroy you, it just wanted to wake you up? What you called the end was just the self trying to breathe under the rubble of the ego. And now that you've seen it, there's no unseeing it. There's no going back to unconsciousness. The shadow you avoided is now part of you. And perhaps this is the true awakening, not the one that brings peace, but the one that tears you out of the lie with your own hands. So tell me, how many times will you need to break down to understand that it's not the world that's hurting you, it's your resistance to change? How long will you confuse stability with stagnation, security with imprisonment, and silence with emptiness? Maybe what you call pain is just your soul trying to get home. If this tore you up inside, sign up now, because that was just the first cut.